is Archivist at the Dunedin City Council, and has also worked on Antarctic history in Canterbury. But most importantly for tonight, Jill absolutely loves dogs. So I'm going to pass it over and we're going to listen to a fascinating evening about the dogs.
Assuming you or many of you also like dogs, or else you would not be here. You know, dogs are the big attraction rather than Antarctica, because dogs are the most important thing. So thank you for having me along this evening. I am currently archivist at the Dunedin City Council, but for 5 years I was the curator of human history at Canterbury Museum and has a fantastic Antarctic collection, including hundreds of photographs not only of the heroic era expeditions, but the dogs that were there. And that's really what caught my interest when I started looking on Antarctic history there. Despite my accent, I have lived in New Zealand for almost half my life. And before I went to Canterbury, I was archivist at Toitu Otago Settlers Museum for 12 years, so I know Dunedin very well. I'm happy to be back living here now. Right, so tonight I'm going to tell you some stories about dogs from the early years of British Antarctic exploration. Some of these stories are heartwarming and speak of the close bond created between expedition members and the sledge dogs, as you can see in this photo here. But some of these stories are heartbreaking and speak of the brutal reality life in Antarctica in the early years of exploration was. However, what these stories reveal is the importance of dogs during the heroic era of Antarctic exploration. Their paw power was vital to the work being done there, and I cannot emphasize that enough. We could not have done what we have done in Antarctica without that foundation that the dogs were able to lay in those early years. I'd like to share a quote from Frank Debenham, geologist on the Terra Nova expedition 1910-1913, which many of you know as the expedition that Captain Scott died on returning from the pole. I believe it very eloquently summarizes the story of dogs in Antarctica. So he says, every expedition which has employed dog transport will testify to the valiant work performed by their teams and will be ready with stories about their more notable dogs. They will tell of dog heroes who pulled a taut trace to their last breath, of dogs who lost heart early in the journey, of shy dogs and bold dogs, of those who were popular with the whole team, and others against whom every fang was turned. Dog personality is, in fact, one of the first thing a driver learns, and the better he learns it, the better driver he will be. So these words come from an article written by Debenham titled Starik, the Story of a Sledge Dog, and was published in the journal Polar Record in 1943. It's remarkable that 30 years after the expedition, he still had such fond and vivid memories of the various dogs and their individual personalities. There was Mukaka, a sprightly, funny little dog, small but very game and a good worker. And Nugis, a fat, lazy, and very greedy dog. But Debenham focuses his story on Starik, his favorite dog, pictured here. Lovely Starik. My dog often gets into that pose and we refer to her as Starik. He tells us about an amazing journey that Starik made when he was separated from his sledging party and other adventures they had. He writes that he began to regard Starik as almost human, and he longed for the time when he could give him rest and peace at home in civilization. However, this would never happen. Starik died 3 weeks before the return ship was due, and it was a blow to Debenham. He ends his tribute to Starik by noting that, quote, the wise little puppy of the Amur was to remain in that distant land, and all we could take back was the memory of his great character and desire to pay tribute to him by telling his story. So, first of all, I'm going to educate you a bit about sledge dogs, dispel some preconceived ideas you might have, and also explain why these dogs were used in Antarctica. So, most people think that sledge dogs are Siberian Huskies like this one. However, this breed is a modern creation of selective breeding and mostly the work of pedigree dog associations such as the American, Canadian, and British Kennel Clubs. The dog was first recognized and registered as a breed in 1930, so long after this period that we were talking about. The same with the dog that we know as Samoyed. 100 years ago, they didn't look anything like the white, fluffy, cute, purposely bred dog we know today as a Samoyed. And you'll see some of these early Samoyeds, and you'll be amazed that they look nothing like today's Samoyeds. So dogs used in Antarctica were simply dogs that had been bred and trained over time to pull a sledge. Before the emergence of modern purebreds, sledge dog types referred to the area they came from. So from Alaska, you had the Malamute. From Arctic Canada and Greenland, you had an Eskimo Husky or a Greenland dog. And in Siberia, you had the Samoyed and the Siberian Husky, which refers to the regions of Siberia that they came from. So these are all sledge dogs used in early Antarctic expeditions. The dog in the top left is from Siberia, so a so-called Siberian Husky, which looks nothing like a Siberian Husky as we know it. The one in the top right is from Canada, and the one on the bottom is from somewhere in Russia. And so, yeah, they look nothing like what we associate with Huskies today. It's thought that the word husky derives from the word esky, which was the nickname for the Eskimo dog that the Inuit used in the Arctic regions of Canada. Husky is often used as a generic word for a sledge dog, and for this talk, that's the term that I will be using. But know that I don't mean today's, Siberian Husky. So as long ago as 50 BC, Husky-type dogs pulled sledges for people living in Arctic areas. This is a plate from Captain Cook's A Voyage to the Pacific Ocean, Volume 3, published in 1784, showing a dog team in Siberia. You can't really see it in this projection, but when you see the actual illustration, they have very wide collars that appear to have bells on them. And this is something that you often see on North American sledge dogs. I haven't found an explanation of this. I'm assuming it's like the philosophy people have today when they go out hiking or tramping in areas that have things like bears. They wear bear bells to warn bears and other predators that they're coming. So perhaps that's why sledge dogs are wearing bells. So a few facts about Huskies. They can withstand extremely cold conditions without shelter. So minus 40 is okay for them to be out. They have a clever way of sleeping in the snow, curled with their back to the wind and their tail covering their nose. This position, which on the left, is called the Siberian swirl. So they hunker down like that, throw the big fluffy tail over their nose, and then as it snows, a drift forms over them. And it creates an insulated shelter, sort of like a little, kind of like an igloo sort of thing. In 1915, during Ernest Shackleton's Endurance expedition, the dogs were housed in igloo-like structures. You can see one on the other side here on the right, that they referred to as dog loos. We have Samson with his dog loo here. There was a dog sailor that was given a church with a spire, so the men took great joy in, they're stuck on the ice, in creating these little structures for the dogs. But despite these very well-intentioned efforts, the dogs generally would not stay in them, and they preferred to be out in the elements unless it was really severe weather. So these dogs were bred to interact with humans, and I own 2 husky crosses. They're the worst guard dog you could ever have, because they love people and they love children. While they love humans, they weren't bred to obey them. I can testify to that. Very hard to train a husky. But if you think about it, you want an independent thinking and decision-making dog. So if you're in a sledge, you're in Antarctica, and there are hazards up ahead, you want the dog team, especially the lead dog, to be able to make decisions about what's going on. So if the dog, for example, senses a crevasse, it will stop. It will know that, and it'll make that decision. It just doesn't blindly go on because it's told to go on. And this is, something that you really want for your own safety in the back, where you don't know what's going on out in front of you. These dogs, unfortunately, have a very strong prey drive. But the advantage to this is you have an animal that you don't necessarily have to worry about feeding. It can fend for itself. It's in a place, in somewhere outside of Antarctica that has wildlife. It can go and hunt for itself. This became somewhat of an issue in Antarctica with all those penguins. And so there's many a story about a dog team that sights a penguin and decides they want, they make decisions. They want the penguin. So they go off after the penguin. I can tell you there are no brakes on sledges. So you go where the dogs go. These dogs also have incredible endurance and strength. They will never give you 100%. So this is all part of their ability to have such great endurance. They always hold something back. So if you think about that saying, slow and steady wins the race, this is very much a thing with husky-type dogs. And finally, sledge dogs were and still are strongly pack-centered animals. Aggression and fighting between them is common and helps maintain pack hierarchy. In Antarctica, they would be kept chained. So you can see the one on the right here, when the dogs weren't out working, would be tethered to a post at a distance from the others. Unless they were young dogs, puppies. Puppies tended to not be too terribly vicious. And well-behaved dogs. They were allowed to roam free. So before Antarctic exploration, there was Arctic exploration. And of course, this is where the idea of taking dogs to Antarctica came from. So this is Tommy, very odd-looking dog. He's an Eskimo dog who was born on the ship the Lady Franklin in July 1850 in the Arctic seas. The ship was looking for the lost Arctic expedition party led by John Franklin. The ship's captain, William Penny, took Tommy back to England, but Tommy suffered from an internal complaint and died there on 28 November 1851, so he was only, not even 2 years old. At some point, he was taxidermied and somehow ended up in the collections at Te Papa. And Tommy is currently on loan to Canterbury Museum, so that's how I had access to Tommy. So Europeans have a long history of using dogs to pull things, especially in Belgium and the Netherlands, where they were used to pull tradesmen's carts. They were also used like that in England, but on the 1st of July, 1840, Section 39 of the Metropolitan Police Act outlawed using dogs to pull carts in London, and the Cruelty to Animals Act 1854 extended this to the rest of England and Wales. So what you see here became illegal in England. This was seen as an inappropriate use for dogs, which were more and more being regarded by the British as pets and sporting animals. So you can take your dog hunting, you can have your dog on your lap, but you can't have your dog working for you like that. British Antarctic expeditions manifested this tension between using dogs effectively as working animals and seeing them as pets and animals to be handled gently and humanely. This tension explains some of the problems that English expeditions had using dogs, which I will touch upon later. So, on to Antarctic exploration. On 18 February 1899, the first dogs set their paws in Antarctica. They were landed on Cape Adare by Karsten Borchgrevink, leader of the British Antarctic Expedition 1898-1900, more commonly known as the Southern Cross Expedition. So for the expeditions I will be speaking about, I will use their sort of nicknames, which are generally the ship names, rather than the big, long, formal names, which all really just sound like much of a muchness anyway. So this is a photograph of Borchgrevink on deck, which is the place where the dogs were housed for his expedition and for all future expeditions. It's very common. His 90 dogs were sourced from Greenland and Siberia, and they were also the first dogs to winter over on the continent alongside 10 expedition men, so just 10 men. Borchgrevink showed his experience and expertise gained from working with dogs in the Arctic. He took good food. There were 28 tons of cod liver oil, fish, meat, and oatmeal biscuits containing 58% fat. So fat's where these dogs get their energy from. The dogs were also provided with coats, which they didn't wear, fur boots, which they could wear because boots are not for keeping feet warm, but preventing ice from building up between the toes, which could cause damage, and brass chains. Borchgrevink also took 2 Norwegian Laplanders for dog handling, Ole Must and Per Savio. So this photograph obviously was not taken in Antarctica because there are trees in the background, so it was either Norway or England just before they left. It took me a minute to try to figure out where trees, did get away. So on the expedition, there's a story about a 4-day blizzard that hit them while setting up their quarters in Antarctica. So while unloading dog kennels from the ship, they were blown out to sea and wrecked in the ice floes. The dogs sheltered in the tent with the men to keep them warm. So this is a romantic-ish story, but imagine 90 husky-type dogs in a tent. It would have been bedlam. Even a handful of dogs roaming in the tent probably would have been a problem, but it's a nice story. So due to the rough topography of Cape Adare, Borchgrevink was unable to venture too far into the interior with the sledges. Although dogs were not used to their full capacity, Borchgrevink's expedition set the expectation that dogs would be part of Antarctic exploration. At the end of the expedition, there were a number of dogs left and needed to be rehomed, so to speak. And this would be the case for any of the expeditions that still had dogs, and several solutions were used. I can tell you that euthanasia was not a strategy that was used by the early expeditions at the end of their time there. They did something with the dogs. So one solution was to give the dogs to members of the expedition. So this was the case for a dog named Joe. A number of puppies were born in Antarctica during the expedition, and Joe was one of those dogs. Borchgrevink gave Joe to Louis Bernacki, the astronomer, physicist, and photographer on the expedition. When Bernacki returned to Australia in 1900, he took Joe home with him, and in 1901, Bernacki and Joe joined Robert Falcon Scott on the Discovery expedition. So this is Joe's collar, which was purchased by Canterbury Museum at a London auction in 2013 with funds supplied by the Friends of the Canterbury Museum. So it's a leather collar with brass studs and 2 brass nameplates engraved Joe Southern Cross and Joe Discovery. We don't know any of the history of the collar. Presumably it was in Bernacki's possession and somehow got passed on to somebody and it ended up in a London auction house. And below the collar is a photograph of Joe, which appears in Bernacki's book To the South Polar Regions. It took me a long time to find a photo of Joe, because I was looking for something that didn't look like that. He has lots of photos of himself with very white, fluffy-looking dogs, and I just assumed it was something like that, but no, that's Joe. So 30 dogs that weren't claimed by expedition members, it's really hard to, expedition, I did an exhibition on expeditions, and the talk on that was just, that was better. So 30 dogs that weren't claimed by expedition members were dropped off on Stewart Island and entrusted to the island's warden, Arthur Trail. Owing to New Zealand's quarantine regulations, the dogs were to be destroyed. Trail got in touch with Sir Joseph Ward, the local MP down there, and it was arranged that Trail could look after them. So the idea was that they would be available for further expeditions. Scott's Discovery was the next one to go, but instead Scott got his dogs from Russia. When several years had passed and no one came, Trail kept a few of the pure white ones for himself, sold some puppies, and destroyed the rest. There's this, among the Samoyed Breeders Club, there's this idea that New Zealand Samoyeds are descended from the ones that were dropped off at Stewart Island. I haven't found any proof of this. Everything I see is that the white Samoyeds were imported from England, I think 1970. But it's certainly possible, probable, that there are dogs in New Zealand, mixed breed dogs, that are the descendants of these dogs that Trail sold to people in New Zealand. So. Scott's first expedition, the Discovery, was a disaster when it came to the dogs. So remember, when Scott grew up in England, it was thought that it was cruel to use dogs as draft animals, and it was also illegal. Scott had little idea how to use them for sledging, and his actions, due to his ignorance, resulted in their deaths. Not understanding how to run a sledge dog team, he physically abused them with the whip to try to get them to work harder. So he didn't understand that huskies work slow and steady, not 100%, and he saw this as a sign of their laziness. He also made mistakes with their food, taking dried fish, which ended up spoiling on the ship journey down. Several years later, one of the expedition members lamented the poor treatment they gave the dogs, describing it as beastly. Without a doubt, this failure impacted Scott's second expedition, the Terra Nova, in 1910. As you know, Scott decided not to use dogs to get to the pole with that expedition, and instead tried man-hauling, so men pulling the sledges rather than dogs, and that had disastrous consequences of its own. So on 1st November 1902, Scott set off with Ernest Shackleton, Edward Wilson, and about 14 dogs to try and reach the South Pole for the first time. Joe was one of these dogs. Dog food was poor quality, spoiled fish, and ran short, which meant that the health of the dogs began to deteriorate and they began to die. Between January 1st and 15th, the last 11 of them died, some naturally from starvation and exhaustion, and some had to be put down by Edward Wilson. Again, Joe was one of these dogs. In his diary on 8 January 1903, Scott wrote, quote, "Joe was sacrificed for the common good tonight," end quote. Scott ashamedly admitted that he suffered from moral cowardice and could not bring himself to do the job, so instead had Wilson do it. Despite the generally sad story of the dogs on the Discovery expedition, there were some heartwarming moments. The ship's steward, Clarence Howard Hare, owed his life to his favorite dog, Kid. During a howling snowstorm in 1902, Hare became separated from the rest of the sledging party. He eventually stumbled upon 3 of their dogs, including Kid. Overcome by drowsiness and fearing he would fall asleep and freeze to death, Hare kept moving. In his confusion, however, he fell down a slippery slope and succumbed to sleep. When he awoke 2 days later, he found a mold in the ice created by Kid. Man and dog had slept sledge dog style, curled up side by side and covered with an insulating layer of snow. Hare believed that Kid's body heat had kept him alive. He was thereafter known as Kid the Courageous. Dog health was an important concern, especially given that they were relied upon for transportation. Sick dogs unable to pull a sledge on a mission that was hundreds of kilometers away from home base could result in death for expedition members. So this is a dog medicine kit made by the Spratz Pet Food Company. It's in Canterbury Museum's collection. It's an incredibly rare object. It was used by William Isaac Weller, who's the man in the cartoon there, who cared for the dogs on the Discovery expedition. He drew a humorous cartoon of himself giving an odd-looking dog some medicine. It looks like crap, but it's meant to be dog. So the tag on the bottle reads, "Dog medicine, to be well shaken before taken," not the dog. And of course, puppies! The arrival of puppies brought excitement to Antarctic expeditions. So having puppies was something that they wanted to happen. They took male and female dogs down. The idea was dogs are going to die, you need to replenish your stock, so to speak, and so there were always puppies. So 17 puppies were born during the Discovery expedition. The conditions in Antarctica were too harsh for many of these new members of the team, and 7 of them died rather quickly. The remaining pups, named Tintax, Tess, Warrior, Patty, Nobby, Violet, Snowball, and Roger, amused themselves by chasing and killing penguins, as puppies will. This was undesirable behavior. One day, expedition member Clarence Hare, who we just talked about with Kid, recorded with humor in his diary, quote, "The pups have been after penguins again, and it is a common sight to see one struggling along with a dead penguin tied around its neck as punishment," end quote. Unfortunately, the puppies didn't learn their lesson, and the next day resumed their hunting. So of course, puppies need to learn how to sledge. So although this photograph, the dogs look like adult dogs, they're actually older puppies, probably about a year old. So of course, little puppies can't really be put in harness and do anything, but when they get to be about a year, then they're big enough to have some strength and brain power to be trained. So although dogs have an instinctive drive to run and pull, they must be trained to haul a sledge, work in a team, and obey commands. They also need to learn to wear a harness. So any of you who've had a puppy, when you first start training it to walk, putting a collar on it and a leash, they don't like that. Something, of course, it's not natural to them. So you gotta get them accustomed to wearing a harness and teach them about the whip.
Oh.
Now, nope. The whip is a good story. So Scott misused the whip. The whip was not meant to be used to make you're not meant to make contact with the dog with the whip. So I learned this from a dog handler I met who was in Antarctica very early in the 50s. And he said, no, the whip is used for a sound, the crack of the whip. So that's how, he said, we teach the dogs about direction. Where they hear the whip cracking, then they know to turn those directions. Either turn into the sound or turn away from the sound. I think it's to turn into the sound. So that's what the whip is used for, right? Not any sort of punishment or pain. It's a sound that they associate with a training cue. He said the whips were heavy and cumbersome, and they ended up just not even really using them. But they survived. Our next expedition, the Nimrod. In 1907, Ernest Shackleton organized his first Antarctic expedition, and he cabled Arthur Trail at Stewart Island and asked for 40 dogs. So here's the next expedition coming through, but years later, a little too late. Trail only had 9 available that were descendants of the original dogs that were dropped off. And on the way south, the expedition collected Scamp, Rousey, Dido, Possum, Queen, Bosun, Hookah, Spot, and Battle. And here they are on show in Worcester Street in Christchurch before the expedition left New Zealand. And as you can see, the dog on the far right there is black and white. But these, are meant to be Samoyeds, but very different looking. Dogs played a minor role in the Nimrod expedition. Shackleton innovated with other forms of transportation, such as ponies. Ponies went to Antarctica. They even had little pony snowshoes, because the hooves would just sink. And specially designed motor vehicle. Neither of these solutions were very successful in Antarctica. Shackleton had been part of the disastrous Discovery expedition, so perhaps this motivated him to consider alternatives to dogs. Or it could have been the fact that Trail didn't have the number that Shackleton wanted. And now on to the big Antarctic story. The most controversial aspect of early Antarctic exploration was the race to the pole between these two men, Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott. Those of you who are familiar with the story know how integral the role of dogs was to it. So on June 3rd, 1910, Amundsen set out from Norway. Everyone thought he was headed to the North Pole, right? Even his crew and expedition members, right? I think only his brother-in-law knew the real truth. So I think it was when they got to Madeira, he announced to everybody, we're going south. And if you want to get off, there's the dock. You're free to go. They all went, no, yeah, let's do the South Pole, let's go. So they went the expedition continued south. Almost 2 weeks later, on the 15th, Scott left England and headed south. Amundsen reached the South Pole on December 14th, 1911, and Scott a month later on January 7th, 1912. Scott, as we know, died on the 23rd of March on the return journey. Amundsen made it back. Amundsen was successful because of his strategic use of the dogs. He set out for the pole with 52 dogs and returned with 11. Along the way, dogs were killed and eaten by both the men and the other dogs. For this strategy, Amundsen has been much maligned. Who could eat a dog? Surely only some sort of dog-hating monster, which is how history often comes to regard Amundsen. But nothing could be further from the truth. In Norway, Amundsen had dogs as pets. Here he is with Pan shortly before leaving for Antarctica. In the diary he kept during the expedition, Amundsen wrote with great respect and fondness for the dogs. We care for our dogs like little children. We grow fonder and fonder of them every day, and the affection is mutual. They howl with pleasure when they see us. Amundsen killed and ate dogs in Antarctica as a necessity. So I'd like you to think about a couple of things. In the brutal Antarctic interior, the only food he had was what he could transport with him. So he took dogs as a form of livestock, with a purpose. He did not take them as pets. And, we wouldn't be outraged if he had taken crates of chickens with him and eaten them along the way. The dogs were a strategic choice in very hard circumstances. Scott started the journey to the pole with 10 ponies. They were ill-suited for the job and shot at the foot of Beardmore Glacier, and their meat stored for the men to eat on their return journey. Scott was not keen on the plan, but it was a necessity. In exceptional circumstances, it's curious that we believe that eating a pony is okay, but not a dog. So we know this was a difficult decision for Amundsen. Reflecting on the expedition, he lamented, "It is my only dark memory from down there, that my lovely animals were destroyed. I demanded more of them than they could manage. Scott took dogs with him on the Terra Nova expedition, but he chose not to have dogs transport him to the pole. Instead, they played a very minor role and were used to lay supply depots and go on short scientific expeditions. Like Amundsen, Scott had great affection for the dogs and treated them much better than he had on the earlier Discovery expedition. You can hear his compassion in the description of the dogs on the deck of the ship shortly after they left New Zealand. That's what you're seeing here. He says, "Upon the coal sacks, upon and between the motor sledges, and upon the ice house are grouped the dogs, 33 in all. They must perforce be chained up, and they are given what shelter is afforded on deck, but their position is not enviable. The seas continually break on the weather bulwarks and scatter clouds of heavy spray over the backs of all who must venture into the waist of the ship. The dogs sit with their tails to this invading water, their coats wet and dripping. It's a pathetic attitude, deeply significant of cold and misery. Occasionally, some poor beast emits a long, pathetic whine. The group forms a picture of wretched dejection. Such a life is truly hard for these poor creatures." In his quote, Scott mentioned 33 dogs, which were 2 Eskimo dogs from the Arctic and 31 huskies from eastern Siberia that had been used to deliver mail. In a fundraiser, English school children had a competition to name the Siberians, and they were given names such as Richmond, Darby, and Sir Andrew. But they already had Russian names, which the expedition members used instead because that's what the dogs responded to. So there was Lapa, the friendly dog, whose name in Russian meant flock ear, and indeed you can see this not erect ears. There's Volk, the burly and rather dour dog, who always insisted he was the strongest of the dogs. Vida, the beautiful dog that Scott described as especially distinguished for his savage temper and generally uncouth manners. And Starik, the dog I mentioned at the beginning that Debenham wanted to bring home. He stood out from the others for his air of wisdom and leadership as the head of the team. In fact, the dogs understood Russian, and the men had to learn dog driving commands in that language. In his diary, Edward Wilson wrote, "We have to use Russian terms with our dogs. Kiki means go to the right, Chewy means go to the left, Eshtu means lie down. And the remainder are mostly swear words, which mean everything else which one has to say to a dog." So there was a 34th dog that Scott didn't mention. Lassie. So Lassie is the dog in the center, a collie brought along from New Zealand. The man is Herbert Ponting, the professional photographer that Scott brought on the expedition, and the other dog is one of the Siberians. And here's a detail of Lassie. Lassie gave birth in August 1911, and the father would have been one of the expedition's sledge dogs. In his diary, Scott wrote, "The first addition to our colony came last night when Lassie produced 6 or 7 puppies. We are keeping the family very quiet and as warm as possible in the stable." A couple of days later, he reported, "The wretched Lassie has killed every one of her litter. She is a mother for the first time, and possibly that accounts for it. When the poor little mites were alive, she constantly left them till not one was left alive. It is extremely annoying." This is Deke. Like most of the dogs on the Terra Nova expedition, he came from the Gilead tribe of eastern Siberia and delivered mail. The students at Sir Andrew Judd's commercial school in Kent named him Sir Andrew after their school's namesake. However, Deke kept his original name, so the D-E-E-K is an anglicized version of his Russian name, which is D-Y-K, meaning wild one. He gained a reputation as an excellent sledge dog, with expedition member Dr. Edward Atkinson noting that he did every journey requested of him and was without exception the hardest working dog on the lot. You hear that a lot from expedition members. Glowing comments about the dogs. In 1912, Deke was part of the search team that located the bodies of Captain Scott, Dr. Edward Wilson, and Bertie Bowers, who had perished in their tent on their return from the South Pole. In this photograph, you see the dogs being harnessed up to the sledge and getting ready to set out. Deke is the dog on the left, straining in his harness with his tongue poking out. Deke's faithful service was rewarded at the end of the expedition, and he returned to New Zealand and the home of Christchurch surgeon Sir Hugh Ackland. Dr. Ackland's connection to Deke and the Terra Nova was through expedition member Dr. Atkinson, who was a family friend. Deke became a familiar canine figure in Christchurch and lived out the rest of his life with the Ackland family. So, nice happy ending for Deke. When he died in September 1920, Dr. Ackland had the head of his unusual pet taxidermied, mounted, and presented to Canterbury Museum. The newspaper reported a few months later that Deke's head was available to view in the museum's recent acquisitions case. Some of you might recognize the sled dog statue there. It's the one at Littleton that was recently commissioned to commemorate the work of sledge dogs. And the artist, Mark White, observed and measured about 20 dogs for the project, including Deke's head. And this is Osmond, Captain Scott's favorite dog. According to Frank Debenham, he was king dog and the most redoubtable fighter. On the trip south to Antarctica, the Terra Nova encountered a formidable storm. One wave hit with such force that Osmond's chain was broken and he was washed overboard, only to be washed back onto the deck with the next wave. After the incident, Captain Scott referred to him as Osmond, our best sledge dog. Going overboard wasn't Osmond's only brush with death. One sledging journey, the team crossed a crevasse hidden by snow. Osmond, as the lead dog, was out in front and made it across, but as the rest of the team went over, the surface gave way. Still in harness, the dogs, except for two that dropped out to the ledge below, hung suspended above the abyss, with Osmond anchored on one side and two dogs with the sledge on the other. The strain on Osmond's harness was slowly choking him, so he was immediately cut free, but it took nearly 2 hours to rescue the rest of the team. The Terra Nova returned to New Zealand in 1913, and Osmond was given to Dmitry Gerov, the Russian dog handler on the expedition. The two are shown here in this photo, with Gerov showing off his Antarctic clothing. When Gerov returned to Russia in 1916, Osmond was given to Joseph Kinsey, the New Zealand representative of the expedition and friend of Captain Scott. Kinsey then presented Osmond to Wellington Zoo. One of the dogs ended up in Wellington Zoo. And newspapers reported on the arrival of Osmond the Great. Nothing more is reported in the newspapers about Osmond beyond December 1917, and it seems likely that he died the following year. He was probably about 10 years old, the average life expectancy for a husky, but a particularly long one for a dog that had led an adventurous life and endured the harsh existence of the Antarctic world. Endurance. In 1914, Shackleton went back to the Antarctic. The South Pole had been achieved, so he wanted to cross the Antarctic at its nearest point. So we've got the Imperial Transantarctic expedition. So the plan was that he and the ship Endurance would land at the South American side of Antarctica, and the supply ship Aurora would land on the New Zealand side and lay supply depots. As we know, the Endurance encountered pack ice and never made it onto the Antarctic mainland. I won't go into the story of the Endurance. If you know it, you know that it's an amazing story. If you haven't learned about it, learn about it, because it's mind-boggling what these men were able to do. So Shackleton had seen Amundsen's success and knew that dogs were the key to crossing Antarctica. he wanted 120 dogs, but ended up with about 68. The Hudson's Bay Company in Canada sourced these dogs from fishing villages around the western shore of Lake Winnipeg in central Canada. In his memoirs, Frank Wilde, the ship's second in command, described the dogs as a mixture of wolf and almost any kind of big dog. Collie, Mastiff, Great Dane, Bloodhound, Newfoundland, Retriever, Airedale, Boarhound, etc. And you can see that in the photo here. They're a motley group of dogs. But they're big and they're strong and they can pull. Shackleton couldn't secure a dog handler and the health of the dogs suffered. He was down to only 50 dogs and 8 pups when they encountered pack ice in December 1914. For nearly a year, the ship was stuck and drifted. In February 1915, the dogs were unloaded from the ship so it could be converted into a winter station for the men. Dogs were set up in their own small igloos, referred to as dogos. And again, we have Samson with his. By the end of October 1915, the decision was made to start disposing of the dogs. So they knew that things were pretty bleak. So they had to start making decisions. Frank Hurley wrote in his diary, Sally's 4 pups, Sue's Sirius, and McNish's cat, Mrs. Chippy, shot at 2:55 p.m. In his diary, Shackleton added, we could not undertake the maintenance of weaklings under the new conditions. A month later, the Endurance sank. By January 30th, 1916, more dogs were shot and eaten, and in March, the remaining dogs were shot. The second part of Shackleton's expedition was the Aurora and the Ross Sea Party. The reason we're here tonight commemorating. The role of this expedition was to lay depots for Shackleton to complete his crossing of Antarctica. As we know, the Aurora broke free from her moorings, drifted, got trapped in pack ice, and eventually made it to Port Chalmers. 10 men were left behind on the ice. Only 18 dogs were taken on the Aurora. Because they were poorly acclimatized and badly handled, 10 of these died during the first depot laying trip, and 2 more died during the first winter. Described by one expedition member as a lazy dog with a criminal-type forehead and dirty habits, Oscar was unpopular with many members of the Aurora. Despite his bad reputation, he and other dogs ended the expedition as heroes. During a raging blizzard, when the men were weak and suffering from scurvy, the dogs pulled them to safety. In his journal, expedition member Ernest Joyce wrote, without the aid of 4 faithful friends, Oscar, Conn, Gunner, and Towser, the party could never have arrived back. These dogs accompanied the sledging parties, and although the pace was often slow, they adapted themselves well to it. Their endurance was fine. For 3 whole days at one time, they had not a scrap of food, and this after a period of short rations. Though they were feeble towards the end of the trip, their condition usually was good, and those who returned with them will ever remember the remarkable service they rendered. The men vowed that for their heroic effort, the dogs would live in comfort for the remainder of their days. So they returned to New Zealand, and as promised, Oscar, Gunner, Funny Face, and Towser spent their retirement in the comfort of the Wellington Zoo. My final story of the night is an Antarctic love story with ties to the Aurora. So remember the Samoyeds picked up from Stewart Island by Shackleton's first expedition, the Nimrod? So when Shackleton's Nimrod returned to Christchurch in 1908, one of the expedition members presented a puppy to Miss Beatrice Curlett, the daughter of a wealthy local businessman. The dog was named, not surprisingly, Erebus. The expedition member who presented the puppy was Ernest Joyce, who would later join the Ross Sea Party. Beatrice and Ernest corresponded for several years, but eventually their communication fell silent. Then one day in 1917, following the return of the Aurora, Joyce was in Christchurch. he spotted Archivist wandering alone in the street and gave him the Antarctic food call, which of course got Archivist's attention. Beatrice was contacted and reunited with her lost dog. She was also reunited with her former pen pal. The two rekindled their friendship, which quickly led to romance and a marriage that lasted over 20 years. All because of the dog. So much of this information came from research that I did for an exhibition held in 2019 titled Dogs in Antarctica, Tales from the Pack. That exhibition has closed, but there is an online version of it, and that's the web address if you're interested in having a look at it. There's some other stories. It goes past the heroic era into the more recent history of dogs in Antarctica and their final departure because of the Antarctic Treaty. But yeah, if you're interested in more, have a look. Right. Wonderful. I will entertain questions if you have some, or comments, or any feedback.
Why did they shoot the dogs? I mean,
Shackleton's, the endurance expedition.
did they eat them?
Yes.
Yes, they did. They were starving. They were stuck.
Well, they should
In
have
ice,
eaten
the
each
ship-
other first.
Pardon?
Dogs are more important than people. They kind of.
True. They really did do everything they could to keep those dogs going. And it was, we know that's the humane thing to do. Because everybody was starving. They've been locked in the ice for a long time. I didn't mention this in my talk, but because you brought up eating dogs, there's a diary in Canterbury Museum of one of the expedition members, and one of the first, so the 4 puppies that were shot at first, he talks about eating the puppy and what it tasted like. And apparently it tasted like crocodile. It doesn't taste like chicken, it tastes like crocodile. No, I don't believe so. They would have had fuel, so they would have been cooking, because they had to melt ice for drinking. So they would have had the fuel to cook the dog meat as well. Have you heard the story about Mawson's expedition? I can't remember the details exactly, but Mawson, the Australian explorer, he and an expedition party got into some sort of difficulty, and I think in the end only Mawson and another man survived. They lost their supply sledge, so they had to resort to eating the dogs.
That was before the Scott expedition, right?
What's that?
Wasn't that maybe before the Scott expedition?
I think Mawson was 1914 or so, but anyway, not Mawson, the other guy that was with him was eating the dog liver, which apparently is very high in vitamin A, and they believe he died from poisoning, vitamin A poisoning from eating dog liver. So yeah, if you're ever stuck anywhere and you need to eat a dog, stay away from the liver. Yeah.
I was just at the beach the other day. A friend had been chased out of the water by a sea lion, and she said her dog was completely useless. Gave it a little bark and then took off and left her to it. Were there incidents where there was other interaction, not just the dog onto the penguin kind of thing, but were they recorded as
They would have no doubt interacted with the seals.
Yeah.
And in fact, the dogs got the better of the seals because the seals were often used to feed the dogs.
Yeah.
And seal blubber apparently is very excellent food for dogs. But I would think a husky, one of these dogs, would have a go at a seal. And especially if they're in a pack
Yeah.
and they've got that strength in numbers sort of thing.
She needs to take more dogs next time.
Yeah, there you go. Yes.
I'm just fascinated at how international the dogs were. How international they
They were. They were.
Astonishing.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, and of course these expedition members were relying on dog expertise from other parts of the world because of course the British didn't have that. So they had to rely on areas where they knew they handled dogs and they had dogs that were appropriate for them. But yeah, a very cosmopolitan group, cosmopolitan canines.
And of course, Russia was part of the Entente Cordiale, so they were allies of Britain at that stage.
And I think some dogs were also sourced from Japan, because there was a sort of a trade in dogs between Russia and Japan. And there's a particular type of dog that they're trying to recover in Siberia at the moment. There's a group trying to preserve this old sledge dog breed, which does have roots in Japan.
I just wanted to ask about another expedition,
Yeah.
because I'm in the Presbyterian Archives, and we've got some photos of dogs from Bird's expedition up at Hermitage.
Yes.
And I was wondering when would that have been?
Bird was in the 20s, 20 and 30, very late 20s and the 30s.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know Bird has this amazing sort of interaction with Dunedin, not so much with Christchurch. Everybody seemed to go to Christchurch.
They've got a memorial.
Bird.
There's a
Yeah.
memorial.
Of course, an American.
There's a memorial at Unity Park for Admiral Byrd.
Is there?
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
we just
Familiar with
visited
that?
today, couldn't we, Rob? Yeah.
We had a refrigerated tank to bring penguins, emperor penguins back.
Right here.
There we go. and there were photos of them with his emperor penguins that brought them in Antarctic, actually in Port Charles.
Right.
Oh.
He had a refrigerated swimming pool for it.
Nice.
It was very high tech to get money.
And Bird also had, he was very interested in dog nutrition. So in the 30s, the later times, they used what's called pemmican as a food. And there was a project between the university, Cadbury Hudson's, and Bird to develop a special pemmican for him. So at the Hawken, they've got the recipes for formulating this dog food. Well, thank you.
Thank
Time for a cup of tea. Does anybody want a cup of tea?
No.
Before we go for our 5th annual lecture and celebration, and we'll be back again next year at the same time, same place, for our 6th annual anniversary. So hopefully the window will be in.